All right, good. Give me a little bit of a pop there.
Check.
Okay.
Check. Hey.
Yeah, good. We're going to have a conversation about spiritual journeys.
Great.
Because that is our theme. We also are in the frame, as you know, of everything is spiritual.
Got it.
So nothing is off limits.
Understandable.
Is that fair, Jer? Did you go away, Jeremy?
Oh, did I lose you guys?
Oh, look at that. You froze on our end.
That was so great. My picture froze. You said, because we're in the frame of everything is spiritual, and Steve's eyes went up like this as he was thinking, and it froze right there. And I'm like, oh man, and it took me about 3 seconds to be like, he's really thinking this thing over. This is going to be great.
Welcome back to Showing Up. This is Kirk. I know it's been a while since you've heard from us. I guess that's just the nature of this season for Jer and I. We're letting our journeys unfold, but we haven't forgotten you, and we haven't forgotten our ongoing commitment, in whatever form it takes, to sharing spiritual journeys, our own and those of some of our friends, with you. This episode that we're releasing today is actually a really special one for me personally. Some of you know that I was an associate pastor at a church here in Redding for a number of years. And I had the privilege of working with Campbell during that time. He was our lead pastor. He became a really great friend and one of a handful of people who have significantly influenced my spiritual journey. Recently, we were sharing a cup of coffee over at Theory Collaborative here in town. And we realized it was time to share his journey and his wisdom with all of you. He's still lead pastor at Redding First. But in this episode, you're going to hear Steve's story, but pay a special attention to how he's still wrestling in the present tense. How he's still working to understand and unpack his relationship with God, the church, and the foundations of faith. This is why I love Steve. I love how he thinks, how deep he goes, how he engages with God and with others on these questions of our time, questions that matter. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I know I did. And if you want to connect with Steve, listen to the end and he'll tell you how to do that. I'm sure that he would be more than willing to chat over a cup of Theory coffee with you as well. If I was to theme this just a skosh, it's like telling a story but different.
Sure.
If we're going to hinge off of your story.
Okay.
But if you just tell your story, that has a tendency to just, wind around in circles and stuff like that. So we call them subject-centered conversations.
Yeah, okay.
And you're the subject.
Okay.
But I know that's going to go in amazing places. But I think in our last dialogue, some of what we're chewing on is something like, what is it like being if I was to build a meta-narrative for this whole thing.
Okay.
And you can accept or reject this.
Sure, okay.
Something like, here's a guy who comes from and has pedigree in kind of the middle of the evangelical world.
Yes.
In education, in life experience,
right.
in origin story, and all these things.
Very true.
Had a significant experience, George Fox.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then has been living out of that ever since.
Right.
And now finds himself still squarely in the tradition as in physicality.
Correct.
But as a thinker?
Right, yes, that's
somewhere
true.
else.
Absolutely,
And so what's that journey been like? What are the implications of it? What are you currently thinking about? What is it like being still inside, but thinking bigger than that? So how are you?
I am still on a journey. It feels like it never ends, man. It is wild.
How would you describe the end of a spiritual journey? If that is...
You would know that I've been consuming quite a bit of Richard Rohr and the like in recent years, and some of where my journey currently is wrestling with issues that I, for lack of a better term at this point, the term that I feel like I'm latching onto right now is this idea of wholeness. And that all of us, everybody on the planet is on a journey toward wholeness with their Creator. and that I would say the end of the journey is when you reach a point, which I think at this point the only thing that we have to understand this would be death, but that in death what happens is we pass to a point of total wholeness with our Creator.
So there is an end.
Yes. However, I have suspicions about what may or may not happen after that, but they're all suspicions, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Every theory that anybody has about what happens after that is all theory.
Total
right?
speculation.
So, as best I know how to try and articulate it and understand it at this point, that would be the moment where your spiritual journey would come to some sort of a transition point.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's the best way I know how to say end.
Yeah.
I don't think it ends there. I think it's a transition point, but we don't know how to conceptualize what's out there.
This whole version of the spiritual journey that we are experiencing right now ends.
Correct.
Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, cool.
Yes.
Cool.
Right. Yeah.
So we have Dr. Stephen Campbell.
Oh,
Doctor.
wow, dropping
Dr.
that.
Reverend.
I just want people to know I have smart friends. I just totally want by association to have that rub off somehow.
I mean, you
on
also
Jeremy.
earned that. I mean, so let's not.
That
lose
is,
it.
I did. There was a point in my defense of my dissertation when they said, "Congratulations, Dr. Campbell," and I knew that it had happened.
Yeah,
that had come to an end.
Yes, yes, for sure.
So we're here with Steve.
Yes,
and I wonder, Steve, if you could just give us a little bit of context.
Absolutely.
Couple minutes just to let listeners know where you sit in the world, kind of a little bit about where you came from, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, my journey began. I grew up actually East Coast, and but I grew up in the heart of evangelicalism. I actually grew up within both a tradition and a region. Interestingly enough, that was in a space of evangelicalism through legalism in many ways. My next door neighbors drove a horse and buggy, and they did that because that was holy for them, as opposed to driving a car.
So
if you drove a car, you weren't a car, right? They were
Mennonite.
There were many people that lived around me that were Amish.
Okay.
I grew up in a Nazarene tradition,
right.
and I tease people and jokingly say that I think the Sunday before and the Sunday after I was in and out of the womb, I was in church kind of thing. And so
that's good.
So I'm just deeply rooted in this. I still am in the Nazarene tradition, which is in the Wesleyan sort of theological framework.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense to people.
They can Google it. That's fine.
Yeah, sure.
Or you can explain it.
Well, kind of the two sort of primary evangelical camps would be Calvinism and Wesleyanism.
So to be clear, the right one and the wrong one.
Well, yeah, in theory, and then everything is an offshoot in some ways from those two. Although that's a hyper oversimplification, but that's easy enough for right now, anyway. And so while our tradition is rooted in things like free will and you have a lot of choice in your relationship with God and how it develops and that sort of thing, I grew up in an era in our denomination where we were known more for the don'ts than we were for anything else, right? The Nazarene joke was you don't smoke, chew, or go with girls who do, right? Any of that stuff, right? And then... like, for example, I did not set foot in a movie theater until I was a freshman in college because the theater itself was evil, right?
Whoa.
And if you participate in that, then you are not living the way you should. So it was both within an era within my faith tradition, but also the area I grew up in because of the influence of Mennonite and the Amish and that whole thing. It sort of bled over into all of the arena, right? Into all the churches in that region and that area, if you will. So I kind of grew up in this phase where it was like, I am in charge of whether or not I'm holy. That is a part of what that produced, right? That legalism produces this notion that says we're the masters of whether we're holy or not because you're holy whether you follow the rules or not.
And the rules are explicitly known.
Well, yeah, you know,
in that sense,
there's
right?
a list, right? But everybody has a different list.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, right.
And so, thankfully, we've moved so far away from that in evangelical Christianity in America, right? The tongue in cheek there, right? How did the listeners pick up on sarcasm on the podcast? I don't know, but
they might assume it's all sarcasm.
yeah, maybe that might be helpful to them when they're talking to me, I suppose. But anyway,
so the list has moved, so to speak. Right?
Oh,
it's just
man, it's
an ever-changing list.
And depending on what group you're part of, the list changes and shifts and adjusts, right?
Yeah.
So, but it was in my early college years, as I was in school, and I began to kind of be introduced to just other thoughts, other theological arenas, that sort of thing. That even though I was within still the heart of what I grew up in, you know, you get to college and it just becomes this season of deep, deep exploration. And of course, you know, by the time you graduate, you've figured the entire world out, you know, thankfully. And one of the things that began to really happen for me in that season was I began to wrestle for the first time in a significant way with this reality that I would now describe as I am loved as a beloved son by my Creator, regardless of what the choices are I make along the way. That my choices don't determine my belovedness. I borrow that phrase from Henry Nouwen. He was really big on that idea of the belovedness. Not just him, but he did a lot of teaching and writing on that idea. So, and in college, it was really the first time I began to really start to wrestle and grapple with that. And then what are all the implications of that in my life, right? Like, what does that mean? And does that mean I can then just, you know, sort of go do whatever I want and I'm still loved? And I, you know, some of those kind of things. But that journey was an opening, really, for me.
Yeah.
It was the beginning of a real opening of exploration. I eventually went to seminary, got a seminary degree, started as a youth pastor at a Nazarene church in Michigan. This loving, very warm, very healthy community, a nurturing place for me to kind of start cutting my teeth on what does it mean to be a leader in this world, you know? And then came out to California. I've been in my current assignment for 18 years. The first 6 years I was a youth pastor here. The last almost 12 now, I've been the lead pastor of our church. It's still very much you know, within the framework of Nazarene world, that sort of thing, which has shifted over the 25 years I've been in ministry too. You know, thankfully, we're not as legalistic as we were. We still have some of those components. I was in a conversation with somebody earlier today about that, about some of those realities. But along the way then, I also then did a doctoral program. And it's a doctoral program in leadership in the emerging culture. And I began to read and explore with just people of lots of different faith traditions and began to grapple with the shifts that are happening in our world related to modernity and post-modernity and what that significant shift is, the ways in which people are just absolutely thinking completely differently. And what are the implications of all of that then for spirituality, for life, for Christianity, for organized church, you know, all those kind of things. And that really became then sort of the next, I suppose if college was an opening of an exploration, my doctoral program was an exploding of an exploration. You know, I read more stuff in those 3 years than, I mean, you know, it just was mind-numbing almost, you know, but it began to awaken me to a whole new reality of thinking, perceiving, living, exploring, and I've not stopped that since.
Nice.
So
that's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Give you a
How old
there?
were you during your doctoral program?
Well, let's see. I finished it in 2007.
Okay.
Mid-40s.
Mid-40s.
Early
Yeah,
40s.
Yeah, early to mid-40s.
Okay. And within, 07 started. So within the last 10 years of going through it.
Yeah, so I graduated in 07.
Oh, so you're in your late 30s. We're not doing math very well.
Yeah, clearly there are not
part of the
mathematicians
mystic
in the room
tradition.
or something, I guess. I don't know.
So Richard Rohr is a long way from your theological and regional origin point.
True.
Is that right? Would
that
be
is
fair
true.
to say?
Yeah. And yet, Richard Rohr is not outside the bounds of Orthodox reality. Now, there are some people who say he is, but in terms of the 2,000-year tradition of the faith that is known as Christianity, he isn't. He's just actually on the far edges of some of what my tradition has been in some arenas.
Correct.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, this is the dive point. This is the there's so many things, great things that you just opened up. We'll just stay on the. You brought up Richard Rohr. It's funny.
Okay,
just for, I guess maybe even for me to clarify, what about Richard Rohr to you makes him? I don't want to have this whole talk be about him, but it is a context for diving in, and I think he was a opening door for myself, my brother, a lot of people I knew in the streams. What about him makes him orthodox, and what about you think you think makes him kind of fringy on that in that world?
Yeah, so certainly his most recent book on the universal Christ puts him on the far edges of some pieces of things. He is pushing some boundaries with that will make a lot of people. I mean, it's only a month old or something like that. That'll make a lot of people highly uncomfortable with some of those thoughts. Some of his pieces of thinking related to that the kingdom being inclusive are some spaces that would put him what some people would consider outside of the realm of orthodoxy. But in terms of his thinking about that, and I want to clarify something here as we move forward. I have stopped calling Jesus Christ, and I only now in my life refer to him as Jesus the Christ, because Christ is not his last name. It is a title, and it has a ton of meaning behind it. And so Richard is firmly rooted in the space of Jesus the Christ, the Bible being formative for faith and life as a follower of Jesus the Christ, that it is important to exist within the framework of the greater body of Christ, known as the church, in all of its wideness, if you will. And even his strain of thinking in relationship to the contemplative way, or what some people might call the more mystical way, that is still within the strong framework of orthodoxy. Right. We have always in the life of Christianity had a strain that has sort of paralleled kind of other streams, if you will, that has always been this stream of contemplative. The early desert fathers and mothers were the earliest example of that, right? And that was happening at the same time that the church was doing stuff in cities, right? Like where, they're building and forming and growing. We have these other folks that are out in the desert, and they're just, some people are like, what are they doing out there? They're just sort of sitting around and thinking and twiddling their thumbs, or, well, not exactly, but so those would be some realms that I would kind of use to describe where he's sort of edging on the outskirts, but also still within the mainstreams of. Is that helpful? Does that clarify?
Absolutely. Okay. What are the implications? I mean, let's just do this. Let's just do this thing. Kirk, also, I'm just going to say jump in, because I have about every time you respond to something, I have 10 more questions, and this one could be a quick one. What is the implication to you of changing the language from Jesus Christ to Jesus the Christ? I imagine it could be different to every person. And so for you, what does that do for you? What does it practically achieve, kind of that you enjoy about it?
So the easiest entry point to that I think is important for people to wrestle with is that by simply changing the nomenclature from Jesus Christ to Jesus the Christ, a part of what it does is it reminds us that the embodiment of Jesus was something that existed beyond just the embodiment of Jesus, right? That what we have in Jesus the Christ, the figure who was here, we say, orthodoxy says, that he existed from the beginning. I mean, the Bible says he existed from the beginning. But we have a very, very difficult time often, I think, trying to conceptualize that or begin to think about, well, what does that mean, right? So the easiest entry point when we say Jesus the Christ is it helps us recognize that this person of the Trinity is more than just the historical figure that walked around while he was here. And I think that becomes such a limiting point when people think of Jesus only as that figure, and they don't recognize that the third person of the Trinity has existed alongside of the other two persons of the Trinity from before the beginning, right? Right. And so that to me, that's one of the simplest beginning points of what that, using that term in that way, Jesus the Christ versus Jesus Christ, what that does for us.
I was listening to a philosopher talk this morning about Jacques Derrida. Who early postmodern work of deconstruction. And so he's walking through all that, which I'm a fan of that work. And so we get to the end of that, and then he goes, but his critique is that Derrida didn't go far enough in deconstructing, because he didn't deconstruct reality. He only deconstructed concepts. Right. Okay. So then he goes off on that. How do you deconstruct reality? And he does a whole talk on that, and he ends up with the essence of everything is nothing, which is an attempt at trying to describe everything as one, but he does it through negation. Right. He does it through a big, huge nothingness. And he's also lost embodiment in the process. Right. So there's a logical argument that he's using, which you find in a lot of mysticism and a lot of non-egoic attempts at trying to describe oneness.
Yeah, you move into nothingness, if you will.
This sort of an idea. And I'm not, there's a value to that, but he ends up with losing embodiment or the physicality of the world.
Right.
And so as I'm listening to him, and I'm like, okay, I like this whole concept, except for where you end, which is why I like Jesus the Christ language, because it keeps them connected. You get the universality or the oneness of Christ, but you also get the smallness of an individual. And those connection points, to me, seem necessary for me to know what to do in the world.
Yeah, one of the people that, again, I'll probably say this name, and there will be some people that will be like, okay, I'm done listening, which is, that's fine. But
they quit a while ago.
Yeah, well, one of the people who actually has a phrase that he uses a lot to describe that is Rob Bell, and he talks about that there is a reality that exists both in the universal and in the particular.
That's right.
Right? That they are both and that's another way to say what I mean when I say Jesus the Christ, because it reminds me that there is this eternal reality that is this third person of the Trinity, and there's this particular reality that is Jesus the Christ, who was here, who walked around and ate fish and whatever else, right?
So. Yep. And farted.
Well, right, yeah.
Oh man,
fully
pay to be.
We say fully human, right?
And they stank.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
In this, in what we're talking about now, with this idea of Rohr being on the fringe versus there being some sort of whatever that is, that's a perspective that people certainly take, and that's a critique they make of him.
Yeah.
In your journey from where you were to where you are,
oh boy,
which I'm not trying to unpack all of that all at once, right? Yeah. But something about how would you describe that from your own perspective? Have you moved to the fringe? Have you moved from one place to another place? Have you transcended something in an inclusive way? Because how do we hold that?
Oh boy, that is a fascinating question. I suppose, I don't mean this to sound like a cop-out, but my first instinct in answering that is to say it probably depends on who you ask.
Absolutely.
Right? That there are certainly some people who would say, well, yeah, man alive, you're like getting ready to fall off the deep end, And then there's other people who would be like, oh, no, you're moving into a space that is full of life and movement and wholeness and, all those kind of things.
Ironically, also called the deep end.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. And so... I don't say that to say that as a cop out. I say that in light of
your perspective, right?
How
would you describe it?
So that's an interesting question from my perspective, because it also depends I find myself in this really interesting space because I'm still within the framework of a kind of a box of faith, if you will. And where I feel like I am right now is I keep bumping up against the edges of this box. Like the box is no longer big enough to hold me, to hold my thoughts, to hold the thinking, to hold the... And in many ways, what I would say is I don't think that a part of the reason for that is because the box is no longer big enough to hold my understanding and my experience of God anymore. Yeah. And so as a result, I find myself certainly moving. I don't know that I would use the terminology of fringes. I feel like I'm moving beyond, if that's helpful. Like it feels like an expanse that the container no longer is big enough to hold where I am and what I'm experiencing. And so I have to go beyond the edges of the box, if you will. Yeah. But it doesn't feel like it's on an edge, if that makes any sense.
So fringe is wrong.
Yeah, fringe doesn't feel right because
something about.
Although, I do feel like in that process, a part of what is happening is I certainly am potentially moving to the fringe and maybe perhaps outside of the boundaries of what this box is in a way that the people who are in the box would say, yeah, you can't be a part of who we are anymore.
Right.
So
from the box's perspective, you are fringing.
Yeah.
I guess. But, I don't see when I think fringe, I think like a movement from center out,
right? Which would
to
assume
an edge.
The box is the center,
right?
But that's not the claim we're making,
right?
Is it?
And what I feel like is happening is the box is just literally exploding, if you will, again, right? Like there's like I come back to that idea of if in my college it was an opening, my doctoral program, and what is happening since then has been an exploding. Yeah. And so the containers just aren't big enough anymore or something.
Or the categories.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And so, but it doesn't feel to me, it doesn't feel fringe, but it doesn't feel like I fit.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What are some of the names of the walls of that box?
Whoa, man alive. You're going to just open it right up here, aren't you? So good. That's a fantastic question, actually. In many ways, the walls of the box are walls that are traditional evangelical walls. The walls that are being wrestled with in all of evangelicalism right now. Things like, how do we deal with and what role does the Scripture and Bible play in our life? How do we read it, even? Where is authority at? Where do we say authority finally rests? Is it going to be with the people who are in charge in the church and the way they say we should interpret the Bible? Most people would answer that question and say, well, it's the Bible. But the truth is that none of us come to the Bible without bias. Nobody does. You have a lens through which you read that book. Authority is coming from somewhere outside of that book, not from within that book itself and the way that you think you're supposed to deal with that book.
And even acknowledging that in evangelicalism is taboo.
Right. I've just busted a wall by saying just what I just said, right? Like that, no, that doesn't fit in the category anymore. If we were to talk about this from the Wesleyan perspective, my tradition has this thing called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And I have a whole new way of thinking about this. I used to think about it as a parallelogram, and there were layers, right, like this.
It's kind of like a hierarchical stack or
right.
something like
and
that.
And the bottom layer is Scripture, and everything has to pass through that lens. I then moved to a description where it was more like a Venn diagram, right, where the Bible was a big circle, and then there were three circles inside. The other three realms of the quadrilateral are tradition, experience, and reason. My latest deal with this is it's actually a guy sitting on a tricycle. And the front wheel of the tricycle is experience. The back two wheels of the tricycle are the Bible and tradition. And the guy's head is reason, right? And a part of the reason why I'm beginning to conceptualize it like this is because we have to be willing to be honest enough with each other to admit that our experience is the lens through which we read, see, and understand both tradition and the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? And that, therefore, it is the wheel, it's the front wheel that turns where the other two are going to go, and how you think and deal with those other two.
So how we think about our experience, how we attach meaning
exactly.
to the facts of our life,
Exactly.
steers how we understand.
Right.
That's brilliant.
It's all through the way that we're experiencing and have experienced and continue to experience life and God and relationship and people and everything else, right? Yeah. There are some people that when I talk to them about that new diagram, they're like, "Oh my gosh, like I'm literally busting a wall of the box." To come back to your question, Jer, but I just feel like that's just honest, right? That us to be a willingness to admit that the way we read the Bible is with the bias of our experience, whatever tradition we've come from, whatever, right? And to me, that's just being honest, right? But that's a box buster, right? Another couple sides of the box to polish it off here. So you've got authority, you've got Bible. You also have things like, how are we going to wrestle with issues that I would say are, I guess if I borrow term not just from Richard but from others, is the issue of inclusivity, which I actually find a little bit limiting sometimes, because the minute you begin to talk about that, people can be like, "Oh, I know what you're going to talk about," and they shut that off. And so if we were to push that a little bit further and we were to move from talking about inclusivity to talk about what is the nature of this kingdom, actually the fullness of the kingdom, inclusivity becomes a piece of that, right? So for me, one of the sides of the box is how we define and what we think is the essence of who's in and who's out of the kingdom.
Yeah.
But again, maybe even that comes back to the authority question, because usually it's the people who are in power that are making the decisions about who's in and who's out.
Yeah.
That's a few examples of all that.
Yeah. Oh man, that's great stuff. Okay, maybe we'll work backwards in. Just that quick question that came from that inclusivity wall was, I just lost it. What did you say of who's in it? You said what is the king? Who is the kingdom?
Well,
what do you think about the term? What is the kingdom?
See, I actually think I find it helpful to actually think about it from a perspective of what is the essence of the kingdom, not what is it or who's in it or that kind of stuff, or maybe nature of the kingdom, if you will, right? What's the essence of the nature of this kingdom? And here's another name if people are interested in looking up and reading some other stuff, right? I have a guy who I went to seminary with. His name's Tom Ward. He's written a number of things about what he has, kind of his key ideas, this idea of the uncontrolling love of God. But what do you do with the essence of the fact that it seems as though the highest ethic in the kingdom that Jesus claims is literally love? And how do you allow every other thing to flow through that lens? This is what I mean when I talk about the nature or the essence of the kingdom, and that reality then has to pour itself out into how you make all the other decisions.
Yeah.
But that gets too messy.
It's way too hard to understand.
Right? It's just so much easier to decide who's in and who's out
based on a list
than it is to say, okay, well, what does it look like for us to actually let love be our primary ethic? Because that's the primary ethic of the kingdom. How do I love the other? And then fill in the blank of who the other is, right? How do I love myself? How do we as now we're going to start to group, right? We call that the church, the body, the people of God, like we have all these terms for it. What does it mean for us as this grouping now, community, put whatever label you want onto it. What does it mean for us to collectively work together in the ethic of love? Oh, well, now you've started to, blow boxes up everywhere, right?
It's not convenient of you to think or talk that way.
Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome.
What has the what are the implications for you personally
Mm-hmm.
of being on this journey?
Yeah.
What does that feel like? Well, let me ask that a little bit more precisely.
Okay,
Because
sure.
what I'm actually thinking about
Yeah.
that is what does that feel like in
Yeah.
the context of also still being in
Yeah.
the context?
Sure. So I'll answer that question in a classic, what some people would be like called postmodern way. And I will simply say it is a both and place. And what I mean by that is it is both freeing to me on a personal level, in a number of relationships in my life, but it's also, and it is a stifling thing because I keep bumping up against the edges of the boxes in places. And so those are the ways in which it's stifling when I'm able to kind of begin to try and explore, what does this look like, right? How does this, that's when it's freeing. But in terms of the construct of where I still am, it very, very much can feel stifling at times. There's this thing that I've been thinking about because I'm trying to wrestle with containers, right? Like containers are helpful, right? They help you do things and carry things around and frameworks to get stuff done and whatever, right? And I've begun thinking about a new kind of container. The problem is it doesn't exist. I've never heard of it, and I don't even know how to make it, right? But it's this idea of what would it look like for me not to be a pastor in, right? So currently I'm a pastor in Reading. What would it look like for me to be a pastor of, right? Like to be a pastor that's still functioning in that kind of role of a spiritual guide, somebody who's helping people on their journeys of faith, that kind of thing, but not connected to any one container. So let me come back to your question and give you some more specifics about what that sort of the both andness of that looks like in my life. I have begun to engage in a number of different conversations with individuals in ways in which I am helping them explore. We are exploring together. We are right. Those are places of freedom, right? But then I have a number of other spaces in which I'm also dealing with things like, church budgets and district meetings and institutional structures and, all that kind of stuff. And that's the places of where it feels stifling.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the institution is bad, right? Again, containers are helpful. But for me, there's this weird both andness space right now.
How do you navigate that?
Not well, probably, if I'm honest, I mean, some days it's great and other days it's just rough. It's hard to know how do you do that in a way in which I'm not compromising my integrity. I'm not trying to be inauthentic in what I'm doing. So, like, for example, there have been some sermon series that I've preached in recent days where I've just really ticked a bunch of people off by some stuff that I've said. But I couldn't not say it because if I didn't say it, I would be being inauthentic to myself.
Yeah.
And the things that I was saying, I wasn't going way outside of the boundaries of our box. I was pushing up against some of them pretty hard, but I wasn't saying, hey, go with me way out here in the Never Never Land or something. You know what I mean? I was, okay. So I did a whole series that we did early this year that I called I Don't Know. And I basically just said there's a whole bunch of stuff about this place of life and faith and Christianity that I think we have to be willing to be honest enough with each other that we have to say, I just don't know. And we don't know, right? It was, in some ways, it was an invitation into this both and space, because what I was trying to do with it was I was trying to invite my congregation into a space where I'm saying paradox is actually beautiful, right? And that one of the beautiful things about paradox is that we get to hold in tension this thing that says, yeah, I think there's some stuff that I know, but there's also a bunch of stuff that I don't know, and I can keep going, And I can actually hold those two things together, right? So, for example, one of the early sermons that I did in that process was, I don't know everything there is to know about the Bible. And I said in that sermon in particular, I don't know if there was actually a big fish that swallowed Jonah. But that's actually not the point of that book in the Old Testament. And if we're so focused on whether or not there was a fish or not, we actually miss the bigger, beautiful reality of what God is actually doing through this tiny little 4-chapter story of this prophet that tries to run away from God's redemptive message.
Why do you think that you missed the point those can't coexist?
Because if what we're so focused on is proving,
so the proving of your belief, not necessarily the acceptance of one, yeah,
right, or having to be so certain of whether there was a fish or not, that if you can't believe for sure that there was a fish, then it means that the message of it is
essentially
negated.
stopping it. Okay, right? It was a fish. You ate him. I'm good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well. Okay, as opposed to seeing this is a God who is up to unbelievable redemptive activity in the people that we least expected. That's the message of Jonah. I mean, my word, holy Toledo, the fish thing is such a blip on the radar in terms of the larger reality of what's going on there. It's like, what in the world? But when I say I don't know whether there was a fish or not, people are like, what? Like, oh my God, of course there was a fish, and there was a big ark, and they found it, and
therefore I'm right.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Which is ironic because in the story of the prodigal son,
yeah,
there are no facts.
I know.
Right?
It's a story.
It's loaded with meaning and truth, but there's no facts.
Exactly.
But yet in the Jonah story, we can't handle it if there's no facts.
Exactly.
And why do you think that triggered those people who it did in your church, I'm assuming?
Yeah, because a part of what that did was it shoved really, really hard against one of the walls of the box, which is the Bible is the final authority of everything, but what they actually mean by that is the Bible as I understand it and as I interpret it is the final authority of everything. One of my pet peeves that I've, and maybe it's not a pet peeve, maybe that's the wrong wording, maybe it's not, I don't know, you guys can tell me after I don't know.
Like
but
favorite issues?
Yeah, is that I part of my explosion has been recognizing that one of the things that modern evangelicalism has done in many ways is we've actually turned the Bible into the fourth person of the Trinity. And now we've made it equal with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in some ways, we've actually elevated it above. And it's like, okay, now that's actually heresy, I think. But for me to say that puts me in the category of, clearly lunatic or something, right? So that's why there was so much pushback, is because I was challenging.
Because they needed that to be true in order to stay certain and comfortable and safe in the world that they had created around that story, at least.
Yes, Jerry, I love your choice of the word certainty there, because so much of what the modern evangelical faith has been based on a search for certainty. And a part of what postmodernity is doing to us, beautifully, I think, but it's really difficult for us, is it's actually blowing our certainties out of the water. And for a lot of people, it's like, no. Where is absolute truth? Well, I think it rests somewhere in the realm of the Trinity, which is naturally a paradox. Okay, that's
and
not helpful.
Claim.
Thank you. Well, exactly, right. Yeah, exactly.
What would you say is one of the most practical, real-time shifts that has happened in your experienced life as a result of your journey, interacting with people, your family, your friends? What's the biggest change since your box explosion and your shift or your click, whatever you want to call it?
Ask me that one more time.
Yeah, in
just
fact,
a little different way.
second of one of my things that
Oh,
happened
excellent.
when
Yeah, that'll help me. Yeah.
one morning driving to work said, "Okay, goodbye, God, I'm done." My box actually, I thought God was my box also, just with all the language and the misappropriation of a lot of things. And so I was done with everything that I knew, God, church, Bible, Christianity, everything associated with it. One of the things, and I realized, oh no, I'm really in trouble here, because that was also my certainty, my safety, my orientation in the world. But one of the things, as I started sorting through, realizing, oh no, I'm okay. We still have the wheel of reason, or the head of reason. We still have experience. We still have some of these other things. One of the ones that I lost was I don't have to be a pushover, and I realized I could be an asshole if I wanted to be. And even just that freedom to me was revolutionary, because one of the things that actually was, I think, a total misinterpretation of even Jesus, the idea of the Bible stuff was just nice Christian pushover. And so that actually had real-time ramifications the way that I interacted with the world. And I was like, oh, Jeremy's not the nice Christian that I thought he was. He says some things that are like offensive or whatever, but it was, and as I balanced out in that, I still can be a guy who, so one of them was not being afraid to hurt people's feelings, I would say, was one of the practical, was hugely freeing and actually more loving to people.
So I think for me in that, I would say one of those things for me has been my ability to recognize that no matter who I encounter, it is an opportunity for me to experience Jesus the Christ in who they are, no matter what they think or what they believe, right? So, and maybe another way to say that is, it was so freeing for me to recognize that I no longer have to be in charge of deciding who's in and who's out, right? That's actually not my call. And when I can see, I have this new language I'm beginning to kind of mull over and work with recently, that I, for lack of a better metaphor, it's that everyone has a seed kernel of wholeness within them from their Creator already. And that if I can somehow get past the layers and try and see that, oh boy, does it change the way that I can relate to them, right? The way that I can interact with them, the way that it can... Now, I'll be honest and admit that the hardest people for me to do that with are the ones that just think they're still all right. Because I find that shell of rightness to be the most difficult to get past, to try and find the kernel of wholeness. But anyway, so that's so funny. Another one of the things, I mean, there are manifold things that shifted in my life as a result of the journey. But one of the things I remember was sitting down with my grandparents, who, when I moved up and did School of Ministry at Bethel back in 2003, I mean, I think there was murmurings in my family that I had joined a cult, and that whole thing, and that brand was scary to a lot of the people in my family's understanding of Christianity and all that stuff. And I remember feeling, like, oh, we had made a choice that just inherently is going to cause this friction for as long as we're pursuing this thing that we think we're pursuing, and they're pursuing this thing. But I remember during my 2-year season, it was so enjoyable to just sit down with them, and I would say, I don't care. I don't even care what your brand of Christianity is, because I don't have one. I do care about love. And I was able to go, that's beautiful. That is so beautiful. But it's exactly what you said, where within that mire, that box, that thing, I couldn't get that place. It had to be this way or this way. It wasn't the both and. But outside of it, they didn't change, but everything in me was just very open to, I received so much more by going, that's a beautiful thing that you guys are doing, and I don't care if I think it's right or wrong. It's your thing, and it's beautiful. It does, I suppose another way that we could maybe characterize that would be to say it does create, I think, a free and a renewed sense of living with generosity, generosity toward the other.
Yeah.
But again, I'm the first one to admit that there are there are certain kinds and pockets of people that are more difficult for me to live with generosity toward. And the primary category of that for me at this point in my journey is the people who think they're right.
Yeah.
That's the one that I have the most difficult time living with that generosity toward, because they're unwilling to go, oh, I might not be right. It's like
the lack of curiosity is.
Yeah. That's another good way to say that. Yeah, people who have a sort of innate, or if we go back to one of our other terms, people who are just totally certain about everything. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's working for you, but it just doesn't work for me anymore.
So one of the things I'm curious about is, as you've gone on this journey, you've been consistently bumping up against this wall, playing outside of it, bumping up against it, which you've described as stifling, which sounds like a negative experience, and yet you've stayed in it.
Yeah, so
and
far.
so there's right.
I mean,
we'll see
how that goes, right?
So far, till this is released.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, but the idea is you're doing that on purpose.
I have.
And so
been.
in some way, the stifling has a benefit.
Yes.
There's something about that is attractive. You might even, that might not be the right adjective.
Sure.
There's something about it that you are committed to.
That at least I have
not
at this point been willing to say I'm not doing that anymore.
Right.
Correct.
It has a utility.
Correct.
Right? There's a benefit in that sense of it. How is that working? Living in this tension. This is a very tension you're describing space.
Right.
How is that growing you? How is that shaping you?
It continues to stretch that space of generosity and my ability to live from the space of what I would call try to be authentic love, right? Like, how can I, even though I feel like I'm bumping up against this thing, how can I still function from a place of love and generosity toward this other, whoever that may be? I also find that it stretches me because it forces me in many ways to try and figure out, how can I help you keep moving from where you are? Because even though I believe you are living from this space of certainty, I don't think that box can last forever.
Yeah.
And so what can it look like for me to try and help you begin to let your box start to crack a little?
Yeah.
Right. So I think for me, some of the value is in trying to crack boxes, if you will.
Yeah.
Trying to help people to recognize that, okay, there's another space here. I think that's a part of what drove my whole series on the I don't know. I'm challenged by trying to want to help bring them along or something, if you will, right?
Are they coming?
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Some of them aren't. Some of them I don't think can.
Why is that?
Because I don't think... I think for some people to embrace... We'll use some of the language we've used already, right? For some people to embrace paradox versus certainty, the entirety of their faith will crumble, and they don't know what to do with that yet. They have not had somehow enough of a revelation that would indicate to them that even if that all falls apart, God will still love. He will still love them. Yeah. They will still be accepted. It just doesn't work. And there are some folks that I interact with that I just don't know that they can...
It's almost like
take the journey, if you will.
It's almost like a kindness to not expect it.
In some ways, I think. And no, maybe not. But
for those who you have seen boxes crack and how do you do that?
Well, some of it I think is I'm a person who I use questions like crazy, right? Yeah. So that's some of it. Some of it is looking for the kernel and trying to touch the kernel, and then be able to say, okay, and what's happening in that space, right? Trying to get past the exterior layers, if you will. Some of it also comes in recognizing the opportune moments when life has a way of cracking boxes.
The great
difficulty,
love and the great suffering.
tragedy, all those sorts of things, and being in those spaces with people in a way that I can begin to say subtle things when all those exterior layers are softened.
Yeah.
Right? So that's some of it too, recognizing that there are moments of opportunity. I'll give you an example of that. In my local church community, we have a portion of it that is aging. I just came through well, you're right.
Probably
Sorry.
all of it is
Good call.
aging.
Yeah. Some of it is already aged and aging further. Is that a better way to say that?
Is aged.
Yeah. But there's this sense in which I just came through a season this spring where I did four memorial services in a span of 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So now here's the bulk of my community that is in a space of sort of perpetual grief, if you will, right? Well, in the middle of those spaces, I have the opportunity to say some things about how do we face this? What does this look like? How do we encounter the divine in the middle of this in a way that is good and whole and still beautiful, but that might not be the way you've thought about him before?
Yeah.
So that's an example sometimes of, death often is a circumstance in which people say the stupidest stuff to each other, how many of the colloquialisms you want me to say,
God's ways are higher than
that kind of stuff. Or, God needed
place.
another angel, shut up, right? But to be able to say things in contrast to that stuff,
right,
where I'm saying things like, Isn't it remarkable that even in the midst of our most raw spaces, we still find God in the middle of that? And it's possible for us to believe that he isn't the causer of this pain, but he sure is willing to enter into it with us. You know what I mean? That's very different than it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in some ways, a part of what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to reshape theology.
Right.
I'm trying to push them to a broader understanding of who God is and where he is and his withness, his eternal withness, if you will.
Yeah.
Have you encountered anyone in what would have been your kind of common sphere at your church or just your friendship circle who, in your awareness of your box, maybe, if that is a good term that you'd say, in the years that you become aware of, and I'm sure we'll become aware of more walls and more things that we go, oh, I thought I jumped into another box. I thought I was leaving a box, but I jumped into another one. Have you encountered people who you kind of go, they don't seem to have many walls, but they're in your stream where walls seem to abound?
I would say, Jared, that I don't think I've encountered many people like that. You said, have I encountered many people like that? I'd say no. I've encountered a few. And a part of what I feel like I experience when I encounter that is that they're right on the verge of deciding that they can't stay in the box anymore. So they're in the process of deciding it's time for me to disconnect from this and get out of this box. There's not a lot of people that I know that are still trying to exist in the space that I currently am trying to exist in, if that makes sense, which I think is what you're asking.
Second follow-up question. This is kind of piggybacking on what Kirk was talking earlier about how you're operating in a bit of a tension in with where your journey is taking you and with what your community is. Are you scared ever?
Oh, yeah.
And if so, and what do you feel like is the most common fear tape that is played in your head?
One of the primary fears that I keep coming back to is that if and when I come to a place where I recognize that I can't exist in the box anymore and that I have to go exist outside of the box, that there won't be a place for me outside the box to function in. That I will essentially be non-functional, that I will no longer be able to do what it is that I think I want to do, because I've only been able to do what I do within the framework of a box so far, or this box in many ways, right? So I would say that one of my fears is that when I recognize that the box is no longer workable, if I realize that the box is living in this space of tension in this box is no longer workable, and I have to actually get clear outside of the box, that now I'm not, there won't be a place for me outside of the box. I won't be able,
or you're irrelevant to your world.
Yeah, or that I just won't be able to survive, like, how do I, I mean, in some ways the box is paying my mortgage, right? Like, to be, if I'm going to nuts and bolts it, right? Like if I go, okay, well, the box isn't going to work anymore. Now I got to get outside of the box. And how do I pay my mortgage? There's like
without just entering another box.
Right.
In some respects, right?
Right, because like what I said earlier when I talked about the, I don't have any other language for this. If I'm a pastor in, and I think I should become a pastor of, that box isn't anywhere, right? Like there is. What is that, right? Like I don't think anybody's writing checks for that necessarily, right?
Functionally, in order for a pastor to get paid, you got to pass a plate.
I mean, currently you're connected to a community of faith where there's a money transaction that's happening, right? And so, like if I were to just sort of nuts and bolts the answer to your question, that's a piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a space out here where I can actually exist, live into the reality of who I think I am, and yet still have a place? And what is that, right?
Yeah.
So
if you had to give kind of a crude percentage as to what amount of your previous life you were going to take with you into this one, how much of BC Steve would come into AD Steve?
At this point, if I were just to sort of shoot it from the hip, I'd probably say I think there's about a 50%.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's some stuff from the origin that is still very good and very solid and whole and helpful and useful, and but there's probably about half of it that it's probably not coming along.
Mm-hmm.
The way I think about that now is that when we transcend the box, which is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's sort of funny how that metaphor has sort of now driven our whole conversation today, isn't it?
Yeah. Transcendence is, I used to think of transcendence as being moving beyond something, which makes it non-inclusive.
Right.
But I now think of it as transcendence being inclusive. So there's no way not to bring the entire experience along. And if we start to think about some of the experience as good and some as bad, therefore leave the bad, well, I needed the bad.
Yeah, that's a helpful.
It's all coming.
Yeah.
But I see it differently. I hold it differently.
Very true.
Maybe.
Very, very true. That's good.
So when I say, this will be a quick little association thing. When I say
sure,
evangelicalism, what are three feeling words that come to your mind? What are three kind of like, what do you?
Foundational, because it was foundational to who I am. Is that a feeling word?
No, that works though. It's just
Okay.
Sense, a sense or a.
I also feel a sense of sadness, and that comes from a space of I just am sad that there's so many that I feel like are stuck. So foundational sadness, and I suppose there's a bit of hopefulness in there too. I think that's a part of the reason why I still live in the place of paradox, at least for now, right? That I don't think I would continue to try and help bring people along if I didn't have a sense of hopefulness that it was possible to bring people along. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so that there's this sense of, there's a journey to be had. So again, it's interesting that the emotional words are paradoxical themselves, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So if you were to look forward into your journey.
Yeah, okay.
Short term, 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, right.
The time frame that you have some sort of influence and predictability on.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Right.
Where is this thing going?
My suspicion is my suspicion is that it is going further out of the box. That I don't know how long the box can continue to work.
Yeah. Out of the in into the of.
Yeah, somehow.
So if you were to influence the of, this new space, we don't know what it is. It might not have ever existed. What do you want it to be?
Yeah, in many ways, it comes back to this recent idea. I've really been wrestling with this idea of the kernel of wholeness.
Yeah.
And that the thought of being able to try and spend time with people, whether that is one-on-one or in a small group setting or something like that, it definitely, when I think about the forward, I don't think it looks like big groups necessarily, because I don't know that you can get a hold of a kernel in more than a handful of people at a time, if you will, right? It looks in many ways like this idea of helping people begin to explore what that kernel of wholeness is, and how do we let that kernel begin to just grow and move and expand within them from the inside out.
Yeah.
That they would move more and more into an understanding and expression and a living from a space of greater and greater wholeness in their life. Whatever realms or forms or containers that would help to make that possible would be what I would move into somehow, that it's this, engaging with people in a way in which this is another layer of it. I think everybody wants to do this. They just don't necessarily know it.
Yeah. Say more about that. Say more there.
I think everybody wants to live into greater wholeness.
Right.
I just don't think many of them don't know how to do that. And many people don't recognize that they need to do that. So a part of the journey is begin to help people recognize that there's a journey to be had in some ways, I actually think that happens when you can touch into the kernel of wholeness.
Activate that.
Right? Because if you can somehow break into a space where you can actually touch that in somebody's life and they can experience it and feel it and sense it, then it's like, oh, I want more of that. You know what I mean? Like, and whatever that may look like, right? Whatever forms or structures that it may be called, it may be, whatever that is. It's that kind of space somehow.
So if someone was looking for that space,
how
would they get a hold of you?
A couple years ago, when this new phase of exploration for me began to kind of unfold about what would it look like for me to spend time with people, and how do I, that recognizing that I felt like God was pushing me outside of the box in some ways, I created this simple little website thing, findmycenter.net.
Nice.
Because again, the center, that's where the kernel is, right?
Right.
If we can figure out how to, and I use the imagery of a prayer labyrinth, a simple prayer labyrinth, because you take the journey in, and then when you get into the center and you can kind of touch that, then you begin to say, okay, now what's the implications of that working its way out?
Nice.
So I have that. So
that's findmycenter.net.
Findmycenter.net.
And they can engage you there. And
there's a link. You can, click. There's an email box connected to it. Awesome. If people were interested in it, if they happen to live in the Reading area and they were interested in having a conversation with me, my email address at the church still works. It's, Reading First, Campbell at readingfirst.org. Right. There's also an email address connected to the Find My Center thing. Okay. Or, come to church, right? Like, I'm there every Sunday, so it's not like,
what church is it?
It's the First Church of the Nazarene.
There you go.
In Reading on Bocelli. It's, so either one of those avenues, really, it's...
So go find Steve.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure.
He's around.
Yeah.
He's of Reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome, Steve.
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be alive, that's for sure.